Lyra's eyes opened to a vast, barren wasteland. The sky above was dark and stormy, swirling with thick clouds that seemed to press down on the planet, making the air feel heavier with every breath. Her body felt cold and numb, as though the crash had taken all her strength. She tried to move, but a sharp pain shot through her side, making her gasp in agony. She glanced around, and the reality of her situation hit her hard. Her ship, once a proud and advanced spacecraft, now lay scattered in pieces, smoking and burning. She had survived the crash, but everything else was lost. The people of her planet, the advanced alien race she had once led, had left her here, abandoned, thinking her dead. There was no one coming to rescue her. The storm howled around her, carrying the scent of harsh winds and sand. The ground beneath her was cracked and uneven, stretching endlessly in every direction. No sign of life could be seen, only the endless cold expanse of desert. Her once vibrant green skin, a symbol of her people's nobility, was now smeared with dust, her bright eyes blurred from exhaustion. She tried to stand, but her legs failed to support her, and she collapsed back onto the ground. The pain in her body was overwhelming. It wasn't just the physical pain that tormented her, though. It was the sense of betrayal. Lyra had once been a symbol of hope for her people. She had been the one chosen to lead, to bridge the gap between her race and the countless others scattered across the galaxy. But now, she was just another forgotten being left to die on a forsaken planet. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise. It was faint at first, carried by the wind, but it quickly grew louder. A low hum, followed by a soft crunch of footsteps. A figure appeared on the horizon. It was hard to make out in the swirling sandstorm, but there was something about the way the figure moved. A human. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She had heard stories of humans, primitive, emotional creatures. Her people had always seen them as inferior, their technology primitive compared to their own. Yet here, in the middle of this wasteland, a human was walking toward her. She tried to speak, but her throat was too dry, and her voice barely a whisper. Her head swam, and her vision blurred again. The human drew closer, each step slow but steady. He was old, with silver-gray hair and weathered skin, a man who looked like he had lived through countless battles and survived. His clothes were simple, worn by time and the harsh elements of this world, but there was an air of strength around him that Lyra couldn't ignore. He wasn't afraid of the storm or the harsh planet. He seemed to belong here. "Are you real?" Lyra thought, but she couldn't voice the question. Her body felt like it was made of stone, unresponsive and heavy. The human stopped in front of her. His face was lined with wrinkles, and his eyes, though tired, carried a sharpness that seemed to pierce through the dust. He looked down at her, and for a moment, there was only silence between them. Then, in a voice rough with age, he spoke. "Can you stand?" His voice was steady, almost comforting, despite the harshness of the storm. Lyra tried to lift her hand but couldn't. Her strength was gone. She had no idea how long she had been lying there, but it didn't matter now. All that mattered was that this human had found her, in the middle of nowhere. I can't," Lyra whispered, her voice breaking as she struggled to focus. The human knelt beside her, his hands reaching out with surprising tenderness. He didn't seem repelled by her alien appearance, nor did he seem fearful. Instead, he gave her a small, reassuring smile, as if he had seen worse than this before. Without a second thought, he carefully lifted her in his arms, his old body surprisingly strong despite his appearance. "Don't worry. I'll get you out of here," he said, his voice gentle but firm. As he carried her away from the wreckage, Lyra could hardly believe what was happening. A human, of all things, had found her. He wasn't running from her or treating her like an enemy. He was helping her, without question, without fear. The world felt a little less cold, a little less hopeless, in that moment. She closed her eyes, trusting him completely, feeling her body relax as she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone in this universe. The storm raged on, but Lyra could feel something inside her flicker, a small, weak spark of hope. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to rest. Lyra awoke to a soft, unfamiliar sound, something soothing. The wind had quieted down, and the harsh sandstorm that had nearly swallowed her whole was now nothing more than a distant roar. Her senses were still blurry, but the warm sensation of being cradled in someone's arms was unmistakable. She tried to open her eyes, but her eyelids felt heavy, as though they were weighed down by the dust and fatigue of the crash. Slowly, she managed to force them open. The first thing she saw was a face, a human face. An old man with silver hair and deep-set wrinkles that spoke of years spent in hardship. His eyes, though, were kind, a calm gray that held no judgment. Lyra blinked, trying to focus on him. Her throat was dry, and her voice, when she finally tried to speak, came out as a raspy whisper. "Who are you?" The old man gave a soft chuckle, and his deep, weathered voice responded. "I'm Jonas. I found you out there. You're safe now." Lyra tried to speak again but couldn't find the strength. Instead, she let her eyes drift around her surroundings. She was no longer on the desert sands, but inside a small shelter. It was humble, made of what appeared to be simple materials. But it was a refuge, one that had clearly been crafted with care. A fire crackled softly in the corner, and the air smelled of roasted meat. The thin, warm blanket covered her body, offering comfort that she hadn't known in what felt like an eternity. Jonas gently lowered her back down onto the bed of furs and cloth that lined the floor. He didn't seem in a rush, as if he had all the time in the world to ensure she was comfortable. His hands were steady, even as his age showed in the slow movements, and Lyra couldn't help but feel a sense of peace in his presence. There was no fear, no hesitation, just kindness. She tried to sit up, but the pain in her side was unbearable. Her body felt heavy and sore, and she gasped as the sharp sting made her collapse back onto the bed. She winced but didn't pull away when Jonas placed a hand gently on her shoulder to keep her down. "You need to rest," he said softly, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "You're not well. You need time to heal." Lyra wanted to protest, but the warmth and safety of the shelter were too inviting. For the first time since the crash, she allowed herself to relax, her muscles unwinding as her body finally succumbed to exhaustion. She had no choice but to close her eyes and drift back into a fitful sleep. But as she did, she couldn't help but think about the man who had saved her life. Who was he? And why would he, of all people, help her? When Lyra woke again, hours had passed, and the storm outside had finally ceased. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft, golden light into the small shelter. Jonas was sitting on a nearby crate, peeling the skin off what appeared to be a strange root vegetable. He looked up when he noticed her stirring, a faint smile crossing his face. "Good, you're awake," he said, standing up slowly and moving toward her. "How are you feeling?" Lyra's first instinct was to sit up, but the pain still lingered, so she merely nodded. "Better, I think," she said, her voice slightly clearer. "But I don't understand. Why did you help me? I'm an alien. I'm not like you." Jonas paused, the smile never leaving his face. He set the vegetable down and crouched beside her, his gaze soft and filled with a gentle wisdom. "I've seen a lot in my time. Doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. A person in need is still a person. I'm not here to judge." Lyra stared at him, her green skin still feeling foreign to her in this human shelter. She wasn't used to being treated with such calm respect. Her people, her race, had always prided themselves on their advanced technology, their superiority over others. To be seen as something more than just a resource or an object was a new experience for her. "But my people, they left me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They abandoned me. I thought I was their future, their hope, but they didn't care. They thought I was dead. I thought I was dead." Jonah's expression softened. He didn't say anything right away, but simply reached for the roasted meat that was nearby and handed her a small portion. She looked at it, hesitating, unsure if she could eat, but the hunger inside her was too great, and without another word, she took the food. It was simple, but it was filling, the warmth of it spreading through her body. "Everyone needs someone sometimes," Jonas finally said. "Your people might have left you, but that doesn't mean there's no one left to help you. You're not alone." Lyra lowered her eyes, feeling a mixture of shame and confusion. This human, this old man who had no reason to care for her, had given her something her own people never had: genuine compassion. She had been taught all her life that her race was superior, that they were the chosen ones of the galaxy, but now she wasn't so sure. The coldness of her people, their dismissal of her when she was most vulnerable, clashed against the kindness this human had shown. She had no words for the emotions stirring within her, emotions she had long buried beneath the weight of her responsibilities as a princess. All she had ever known was duty, sacrifice, and the belief that she was destined to save her people. But in this moment, as she sat in this humble shelter, with an old man who had no reason to help her, she began to wonder if there was more to life than duty. If maybe there was room for something else. Over the next few days, Jonas continued to care for Lyra as she recovered. Every time she tried to get up, he would gently remind her to rest. He showed her the basics of survival on this harsh planet: how to gather food, how to find water, how to use the landscape to their advantage. He spoke of his past, of battles fought and lost, of family and friends who had long since passed away. His stories were simple but carried a depth that made Lyra listen with rapt attention. One day, as they sat by the fire together, Jonas spoke of a world far away, a place called Earth. He spoke of the blue skies, the vast oceans, and the green forests that covered the planet. Lyra listened intently, fascinated by the vivid descriptions. "I've been to a lot of places in my time," Jonas said, his voice distant, as though recalling the past with a fondness that only time could bring. "But nothing compares to Earth. It's full of life, simple, pure, and beautiful. I've seen good and bad, but the thing that keeps people going is the way they help each other. No one's perfect, but everyone has the ability to be kind." Lyra sat silently, absorbing his words. She had never truly understood the concept of kindness, at least not in the way Jonas described it. Her people had always believed that strength came from power, superiority over others, control and domination. But here, in the presence of this old man, she saw a different kind of strength, a strength built on compassion, understanding, and the willingness to help those in need. Jonas didn't need to prove anything. He had nothing to gain from helping her, but he did it anyway. And for the first time, Lyra realized that maybe, just maybe, her people had been wrong about what truly made a race strong. As the days passed, she found herself growing stronger, both physically and mentally. Her body healed, and the pain that had once ruled her was now a distant memory. But more importantly, something inside her began to shift. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She wasn't just a symbol of her race's superiority. She was a person, a being with emotions, dreams, and a future that she could shape for herself. And as Jonas continued to care for her, Lyra made a silent vow to herself. She would return to her people, not as the cold, unfeeling leader they had expected, but as something entirely new. She would show them the strength of compassion, of kindness, and of the power of working together. For the first time, she felt like she had a purpose, one that wasn't defined by her people's expectations, but by her own sense of right and wrong. In the kindness of a stranger, Lyra found a new hope, a hope for herself, for her people, and for the future. As the days passed, something unexpected began to form between Lyra and Jonas. It started out small, simple moments that didn't seem to mean much at first, but soon added up into something deeper. The air between them was comfortable, like two people who had known each other for a lifetime, even though in truth, they had only met days ago. Every morning, Jonas would wake up first, stoking the fire and gathering food for their breakfast. Lyra, still feeling weak but improving with each day, would wake to the sound of his humming, a low, soothing tune that seemed to echo through the small shelter. At first, she wasn't sure what to make of it, but as time went on, she found herself enjoying the soft melody, a comforting sound amidst the stillness of the desert planet they now shared. One morning, as the sun rose high in the sky, casting golden rays over the shelter, Lyra decided to try something she had never done before. She wanted to help Jonas, to do something in return for the kindness he had shown her. It wasn't much, but she knew that every little action mattered in their small, isolated world. She slowly made her way to the fire, where Jonas was preparing a small meal of roasted. The scent of cooking food filled the air, making her stomach growl despite the meal she had already eaten. "Jonas, let me help you," she said softly, her voice still a little weak, but filled with determination. She had never cooked before, never had the need. But here, in this foreign place, she wanted to do something that mattered. Jonas looked up from his work, a surprised expression crossing his face before he broke into a warm smile. "You're sure? You don't have to do anything." "I want to," Lyra said, a hint of pride in her voice. "I've learned from watching you. Let me try." Jonas chuckled and handed her a small knife, motioning toward the vegetables. "All right then, let's see what you've got." It was a small act, but for Lyra, it felt significant. She carefully sliced the root vegetables, clumsy at first, but as she went on, she found a rhythm. She could feel Jonah's eyes on her, but not in a way that made her uncomfortable. He was there, offering silent encouragement without a word. Over the next few days, Lyra continued to help Jonas with the daily tasks, gathering water, tending to the fire, and preparing their meals. With each task, she felt herself becoming stronger, not just physically but emotionally as well. She was no longer just the alien princess, abandoned by her people. She was a person, a companion, sharing in the simple joys of life with another. The world felt different now, softer in a way she hadn't known it could be. As they worked together, Jonas began to tell her more about his life, about the world he had come from. He spoke of Earth, of the battles he had fought in his younger years, and of the family he had lost along the way. Lyra listened intently, fascinated by the stories he shared. She had never really understood what it meant to have a home, a family. Her people had always been focused on duty and power, and emotions were often seen as weaknesses. But here, listening to Jonas' stories, she realized that there was something beautiful in the connections people formed with one another. One evening, as the two sat by the fire, Lyra found herself asking a question that had been on her mind for some time. "Why did you help me? Why did you save me when you didn't have to?" Jonas looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. He had been quiet for a long time, staring into the flames as if lost in his thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "I've lived a long life, Lyra," he said, his voice low but steady. "I've seen a lot of things, good and bad. But in the end, what really matters is the people we help, the lives we touch along the way. I've lost a lot of people, some I couldn't save, others who were taken from me. But you, I saw you out there, alone and struggling, and I couldn't just leave you to die. No one deserves that, no matter who they are." Lyra was silent for a long time, taking in his words. She had always been taught to see her people as superior to others, to believe that their technology and their power made them the rulers of the galaxy. But Jonas had no such power, no advanced technology at his disposal. He had no reason to help her, no reason at all. And yet he had. The simplicity of his kindness struck her deep, and for the first time, she began to question everything she had been raised to believe. As the days passed, the bond between them deepened. They shared not just tasks, but moments, quiet, simple moments that spoke volumes. Lyra began to understand the true meaning of companionship, of trust, and of what it meant to be truly seen and cared for. And in return, she shared pieces of herself with Jonas, her fears, her hopes, her memories of the life she had left behind. One evening, as the stars filled the sky above them, Lyra asked another question, one that had been growing in her heart since she had first met Jonas. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice soft, unsure of herself. "What will I do when I'm strong enough to leave this place? My people, they're out there, and they'll need me." Jonas didn't immediately answer. Instead, he looked at the stars, his eyes distant, as if searching for the answer in the endless expanse above them. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "Lyra, you're not the same person you were when you came here, and your people, they might need you, but you need to decide what kind of person you want to be. Power, duty, all of that. It's not the whole story. Maybe it's time for you to choose your own path." His words were simple but carried the weight of a lifetime of experiences. For a moment, Lyra didn't know how to respond. She had always been defined by her role, by her position as the princess, the one who was supposed to lead her people to greatness. But Jonas was right. She was no longer that person. She had learned so much here, in this small, isolated corner of the world. She had learned what it meant to be human, to care for others, and to be cared for in return. She had learned that strength didn't come from superiority. It came from kindness, from understanding, and from the connections we make with others. As the fire crackled softly between them, Lyra made a decision. She would return to her people, but she wouldn't be the same. She would be someone different, a person who understood the value of compassion, of standing up for what was right, even when it meant challenging everything she had ever known. And with that decision, the bond between her and Jonas became something even deeper, something that couldn't be broken, no matter what the future held. In the days that followed, they continued to grow closer, working side by side, learning from each other, and preparing for the journey that would take them back to the world Lyra had once known. But as they worked, they both knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Lyra's people had once turned their backs on her, and the journey to reclaim her place among them would be difficult. But with Jonas by her side, she felt stronger than ever. What had started as an act of kindness, an unexpected gesture from a stranger, had turned into something much more, an unbreakable bond that would change not only their lives, but the fate of an entire race. Days turned into weeks as Lyra grew stronger under Jonas's care. Every morning, the sun would rise over the barren desert landscape, casting its warm glow on the shelter where they had found peace. The vast, endless stretch of the world outside seemed to shrink with each passing day. Inside their small refuge, there was only the sound of the crackling fire, the chirping of the desert insects, and the soft hum of Jonas's voice as he sang his quiet songs. It was a world that felt more real than any Lyra had ever known. But while Jonas's kindness had healed her body, it was something deeper that she had begun to feel stirring inside her, something she couldn't quite place at first. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It wasn't just the sense of being cared for. It was a realization that started small, but grew with each passing moment. One evening, as Lyra sat on the ground, helping Jonas prepare the evening meal, a thought crossed her mind. She had been so consumed by her sense of duty to her people, so focused on the role she had been born to play, that she had never stopped to think about who she truly was. It wasn't until she had been left to die in the desert, abandoned by everyone she had ever known, that she began to see things clearly. Her people, her own kind, had thrown her away. They had seen her as nothing more than a tool, a pawn to be used for their own ambitions. She had been raised to believe that her power, her position, was the key to everything. That was the way of her world. Strength, superiority, control, that was what mattered. But now, here in this small corner of the galaxy, she was seeing another truth. A truth that was far different from the one she had been taught. She looked up at Jonas, who was busy adjusting the fire to roast their food. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost meditative. He wasn't a warrior, not like the soldiers of her world. He wasn't rich, powerful, or influential. He was just a man, a kind old man who had lived a hard life. And yet there was something about him that made Lyra feel like she had found something more important than all the power and riches she had once dreamed of. It wasn't the grand gestures he made. It wasn't the strength he showed when he defended her or the wisdom he shared in their quiet talks. No, it was something far more profound. The way he treated her as an equal. The way he saw her not as a princess, not as a powerful alien, but as a person. And in return, she had begun to see him in the same way. In those moments, Lyra began to realize just how much she had been blinded by her own arrogance. She had been so caught up in her position, her status, that she had never stopped to think about what it truly meant to live, to be free, to be happy, to connect with others on a level that went beyond status and power. Jonas, in his quiet way, had shown her that. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she spoke, her voice softer than usual. "Jonas," she said, her words a little hesitant. "I've been thinking a lot about who I am, and who I've been." Jonas looked up from the fire and smiled warmly. "What do you mean?" "I've spent my whole life thinking that power and control were the most important things, that they defined me," she explained. "But now I'm not so sure. You've taught me that there's more to life than being powerful. There's more to being alive than just doing what is expected of you. And I don't know. I feel like I've been living someone else's life." Jonas's smile softened. He didn't say anything at first, instead watching her carefully, as if weighing her words. Finally, he spoke. "You've been living the life that was given to you, but you're more than that, Lyra. You have the power to choose who you want to be. It's not the title, the crown, or the position that matters. It's what you do with your life that defines you." Lyra looked down at her hands, the hands that had once been used to command armies, to give orders to those who served her. Now, they felt different, smaller, perhaps, but in some strange way that didn't feel like a bad thing. There was something freeing about it. "I want to help people," she said quietly, more to herself than to Jonas. "I want to make things right. I want to change things for the better. But I don't know if I can go back to my people. I don't know if they'll accept me as someone different." Jonas walked over and sat down next to her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. His touch was kind, not overwhelming, just enough to remind her that she wasn't alone. "It's not about them accepting you," he said, his voice steady. "It's about you accepting yourself. And if you want to change things for the better, you'll have to be the one to start. You can't wait for others to show you the way." Lyra thought about his words for a long time. What Jonas was saying made sense. She couldn't go back to her people with the same mindset. She couldn't return as the person who had once been a symbol of power and control. If she wanted to make a difference, she would have to return as someone new. Someone who was willing to fight not just for her people, but for everyone, no matter their race or status. As she sat there beside Jonas, the stars above them shining brightly in the endless sky, Lyra made a decision. She would go back to her people, but she wouldn't be the same. She would bring with her a new vision, one of compassion, of unity, of standing up against the cruelty that had once defined her world. She didn't know how she would change things, or if her people would even listen. But one thing was certain. She would no longer be the person they had once abandoned. She would be someone who fought for what was right, someone who could stand beside Jonas, and stand beside others, as an equal. "I'll do it," she said suddenly, her voice filled with newfound determination. "I'll go back, but I'll do it my way. I'll show them that there's more to life than power. I'll show them that kindness, that love, can change the world." Jonas smiled at her, a proud glimmer in his eyes. "I know you will, Lyra. I know you will." And so, as the night stretched on, Lyra made her choice. She was no longer the princess of a world built on power. She was someone new, someone who understood that the greatest strength came not from domination, but from compassion. And with Jonas by her side, she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The road back would be difficult. There would be resistance. There would be those who would fight her at every turn. But Lyra was no longer afraid. She had discovered the most powerful weapon of all, the power to change, to evolve, and to choose her own fate. With that, Lyra's journey was just beginning. A journey that would not only change her world, but the fate of an entire race. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the desolate wasteland that had become home for Lyra and Jonas. The small shelter they had built out of scavenged materials was beginning to show signs of wear, but it had been a place of refuge, a sanctuary from the harsh world outside. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day. Jonas, the old man who had saved her life, had become more than a friend. He had become her protector, her teacher, and perhaps even someone who had begun to feel like family. But as the days stretched on, Lyra could not shake the nagging feeling that something was not right. It was as though a shadow loomed over them, waiting for the right moment to strike. She had tried to ignore it, focusing on the simple tasks of survival, helping Jonas with the daily chores, learning more about the human ways, and thinking about how she could fulfill her promise to change her people's ways. But deep down, a sense of unease gnawed at her. One evening, as they sat together around the fire, the crackling flames casting flickering lights on their faces, Lyra's thoughts wandered to the distant memories of her home planet. Her people, the ones who had once seen her as their princess, had abandoned her to die in this wasteland. She had sworn to return to them, to show them that change was possible, that kindness and compassion could be the true strength of her people. But that promise seemed more distant with each passing day. Jonas noticed the distant look in her eyes and gave her a soft smile, a reassuring one. "What's troubling you, Lyra?" he asked, his voice warm and steady. Lyra hesitated. She didn't want to worry him, but the weight of her own thoughts was becoming too much to bear. "I've been thinking about my people," she said slowly. "What if they don't accept me? What if they see me as weak for wanting to change? I promised myself I'd make things right, but I'm afraid that when I return, I won't be able to change their minds." Jonas put a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but kind. "You don't have to worry about them. You've already made up your mind. You've already chosen the right path. It's not about what they think. It's about doing what's right." Lyra nodded, grateful for his words, but the doubt still lingered. It wasn't long before that doubt began to turn into something more dangerous. A few days later, they woke to find their shelter surrounded by unfamiliar ships. Dark and imposing, the ships hovered like vultures, casting shadows over the land. Lyra's heart raced as she realized what was happening. Her people had found her. They had come to retrieve her, but they had also come to remind her of their power. From one of the ships, a figure stepped out, tall, regal, with the same unmistakable features of the elite from her world. It was Commander Valen, a leader of her people's military forces. Lyra felt a chill run down her spine as she locked eyes with him. She had known this day would come, but she had hoped for more time. "Lyra," Valen's voice echoed, cold and commanding. "You've made a grave mistake in abandoning your people. You were meant to lead us, not to hide away like this." Jonas stepped forward protectively, standing between Lyra and Valen. His eyes were fierce, his voice steady. "She doesn't owe you anything. She's free to choose her path." Valen's gaze shifted to Jonas, his lips curling into a sneer. "A human," he spat. "You're the reason she's here, aren't you? You've corrupted her with your weakness. You've filled her head with lies." Lyra stepped forward, standing by Jonas's side. "I haven't been corrupted," she said, her voice firm, but not without fear. "I've learned the truth. The truth about power, about leadership, about what it means to be strong. And it's not what you taught me. It's not what you all have done to my people." Valen's expression twisted into one of rage. "You are no longer welcome among us, Lyra. You have forsaken your birthright. If you refuse to return, then you will suffer the consequences." Before Lyra could respond, the air seemed to hum with tension. Suddenly, a sharp metallic clang rang out from the ship, followed by a blast of energy. It was a warning shot. The ground trembled beneath them, and the sound of the blast echoed through the valley. Jonas grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her back, his face filled with urgency. "Get inside now." The ground shook again as another shot rang out, this time much closer. The walls of their shelter cracked as the energy blast impacted the ground just outside. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Her people had come to take her back, but they had come with force, with threats. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about control. It was about making sure that no one ever dared to defy them. Jonas's grip tightened, and for the first time, Lyra saw the fear in his eyes. "We need to get out of here. Now." He pulled her toward the back of the shelter, trying to keep them both out of sight from the ships. But it was too late. Valen had already ordered his forces to descend. A team of elite soldiers in armor dropped from the ships, their boots thudding heavily as they landed in a perfect formation. They were fast, efficient, trained to take control of any situation. And Lyra knew that this was the moment of truth. She had hoped that her people would understand, that they would listen to her and see that the old ways were broken. But in that moment, she understood one terrible truth. Her people had not come to save her. They had come to punish her. Jonas and Lyra ran toward the nearest cover, but as they moved, one of the soldiers caught sight of them. A shot rang out, narrowly missing Jonas by inches. He stumbled, falling to the ground as the force of the blast pushed him off balance. "No," Lyra cried, rushing to his side. But as she reached for him, the soldiers closed in. Valen's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Take her. She's no longer of any use to us." Lyra's heart sank. The one person who had shown her kindness, who had believed in her, was now caught in the crossfire. She had come so far, only to be betrayed by those she had once trusted. She turned to face Valen, her eyes blazing with fury and hurt. "You'll never control me again. You'll never control anyone again." Valen's eyes narrowed, a cold smile playing at the corner of his lips. "We'll see about that." As the soldiers closed in, Lyra felt the weight of her situation crash down on her. She had been betrayed, by her people, by the very system she had once been a part of. But in that moment, she realized something else. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been oppressed, everyone who had been silenced by the powerful. And she would never go back to that life. With Jonas still on the ground, Lyra turned to face the soldiers, her fists clenched, her mind racing. She was done running, done hiding. This fight was just beginning. The scene before Lyra was chaotic, overwhelming. She could feel the heat of the energy blasts still sizzling in the air around her. The soldiers had her cornered. Jonas lay motionless on the ground beside her. Her people, once her family, had now turned into enemies, ready to drag her back to a life she no longer believed in. But something inside her had shifted. The doubts that had once clouded her vision, the fears that she wasn't strong enough, that she didn't have the power to make a difference, had vanished. In their place, a fierce clarity burned. She had been given a second chance at life, and she would not let it slip away. She could no longer run. She would fight. The soldiers, closing in on her with their weapons drawn, seemed to hesitate for a moment. They had expected Lyra to submit, to comply with their orders without question. After all, she had once been their princess, the one who would lead them. But what they didn't expect was the fire that now burned within her. They didn't expect her to resist, to fight back. One of the soldiers stepped forward, his face a mask of anger and disbelief. "You dare defy us, Lyra." He spat, his voice laced with venom. "You are nothing now. You have no power." Lyra's eyes locked onto his. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady. "I have more power than you could ever understand." She could feel the ground beneath her feet trembling. The ships above them had unleashed another blast, shaking the very air around them. But in that moment, Lyra didn't flinch. Instead, she turned toward Jonas, whose body still lay crumpled on the ground. His breathing was shallow. but he was alive. That was all that mattered. She wasn't going to let him down now. Ignoring the soldiers' shouts, Lyra crouched beside Jonas, her heart pounding in her chest. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at her with a dazed expression. "Lyra," he whispered, his voice weak. "I'm here, Jonas," she said softly, her hand gently brushing his cheek. "We're going to get out of this. You have to trust me." Jonas managed a weak smile, his hand reaching up to grasp hers. "I always do." Lyra helped him to his feet, her mind racing. There was no way they could fight the soldiers head-on, not with the odds stacked against them. But there had to be another way. She wasn't just going to roll over and let them take her again. She had a new plan, a new purpose, and for the first time, she knew exactly what she had to do. Her people, the ones who had abandoned her, who had left her to die in this wasteland, needed to learn a lesson. They needed to see that things had changed, that Lyra had changed. She would not return to their oppressive ways, and she would not let them continue down the path of destruction. If it took every last ounce of her strength to make them see that, then so be it. Lyra's mind clicked into action. She had seen how the soldiers operated, how they used their advanced technology, their weapons, their strength. They had no idea what she was capable of now. They had underestimated her, and that was their biggest mistake. With a steady breath, Lyra reached into her pack and pulled out a small device she had been working on since arriving in this wasteland. It was an experimental piece of technology that Jonas had helped her build, something that could turn the tide of this fight. She had no idea how effective it would be, but it was their only hope. "Get ready," she whispered to Jonas, her eyes filled with determination. "This is our chance." Jonas nodded, his face pale but resolute. Together, they stepped away from the cover of the shelter and into the open. The soldiers, sensing movement, aimed their weapons at them. But Lyra wasn't afraid anymore. She had a purpose, and nothing was going to stop her. With a swift motion, Lyra activated the device. A bright, blinding light burst from it, temporarily disabling the soldiers' weapons. The energy pulses they had been sending out stopped in midair, their weapons frozen. It was a moment of chaos, a window of opportunity. And in that moment, Lyra and Jonas seized it. "Now!" Lyra shouted. Jonas didn't hesitate. He grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her forward as they dashed toward the ships. The soldiers, disoriented by the sudden disruption, were struggling to regain control of their weapons. But it was too late. Lyra and Jonas had already made their move. They reached the nearest ship, where the hatch was still open. And without thinking twice, Lyra leaped inside. Jonas followed close behind, slamming the hatch shut behind them. Inside, the ship was cold, the hum of machinery filling the air. Lyra didn't know how to fly it, but she didn't need to. She had seen enough of the controls to know that she could make it work. Jonas helped her, his hand steady despite the chaos outside. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice urgent. "They'll be back on their feet soon." Lyra nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't have time to think about the risks. She didn't have time to second-guess herself. The future of her people was in her hands now, and she wasn't going to let them down. With a deep breath, Lyra activated the engines. The ship roared to life, the powerful thrusters pushing them into the air. The soldiers below were shouting, but there was nothing they could do. Lyra and Jonas were gone, rising into the sky, leaving the wasteland behind them. As the ship soared higher, Lyra looked down at the planet below. Her heart was heavy, but it wasn't with fear, it was with resolve. She had been given a second chance at life, a second chance to change the course of history. She could feel the weight of the responsibility, but she also felt a surge of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Jonas, and together they could bring about a new era. Her people had abandoned her, but she wouldn't abandon them. They needed to see the truth. That power was not about control, it was about compassion. And she was going to show them. The ship broke through the atmosphere, heading toward the stars. Lyra's heart raced with anticipation. The journey ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer afraid. She was ready. This was only the beginning of the new era she had promised to bring. A time of change, of hope, and of freedom for her people. She glanced at Jonas, who was standing beside her, his face filled with determination. He had always believed in her, and now she believed in herself. Together, they would change the fate of an entire race.